Since my last video going over Sonic the Fighter's mechanics and the STF bracket at Combo Breaker 2024, there have been a decent amount of new players coming into the game. And with that, I've had some folks ask me to make a video that would help them choose their main. STF has a small cast, with most characters sharing similar movement and inputs, but character choice still plays a big role in the game. So with that in mind, here's an overview of the game's legal cast, including their strengths and their weaknesses. Let's start it off with the official character of the game, Sonic. The titular character of Sonic the Fighters is considered a top tier in this game. Despite his reputation as the fastest thing alive, he's actually not noticeably faster than the rest of the cast, but his moveset does give him the tools to handle a variety of situations in a variety of ways. And a skilled Sonic player can be one of the most unpredictable opponents this game can throw at you. Much like in Smash, Sonic is a character who handles many of his problems in STF the same way, by turning into a ball. Moves like Spin Dash and Air Spin give him access to large and persistent hitboxes, something that can be hard to come by in Sonic the Fighters. His spin-based sidestep punch gives him an easy move to dodge and attack opponents with that can also hit them from across the stage and break barriers. His air spin lets him easily counter hit and cross up opponents, and even his command grab Dizzy Spin allows him to use his spin dashes to do hefty damage and put opponents into a hard knockdown. Beginner players will sometimes gravitate to Sonic for his punch string, which can also be converted into a spin at the end. But the string here is not actually a true combo, and while its last hit does break barriers, it can be risky against opponents who know they can sidestep out of it and counter hit. When playing Sonic and facing an opponent, it might be better instead to go for Volley Toss. This move is active on frame 11, making it one of the game's fastest front-facing normals. If opponents don't tech the move, you can also quickly 8P after the first hit to spike your opponent like a volleyball. Whether you want to aggress or you want to time opponents out, or whether you want to just play the game, Sonic will suit you well. That said, once your opponents stop letting you spam punch to win, winning with Sonic can prove to be more challenging than winning with some of the game's more straightforward characters. Pick Sonic if you want to fully engage with the game and your opponents while still having incredible tools at your disposal. So yeah, Sonic is very good, but for most of STF's history, Knuckles has been seen as the game's absolute best character. And despite his position as the first and weakest opponent in the game's arcade mode, he's a character that can utilize many of the game's most overtuned techniques effectively, who, like his clone Honey, can never be counted out of a match thanks to his incredible aggression. Knuckles' sidestep may be the key to it all. Use it while holding forward to zoom toward your opponent and escape whatever measly attempts they're making to hurt you. From there, you can use his punch kick to more or less safely do damage and pressure block, his PPP to break barriers or launch your opponent, or his skip kick to, do skip kick. Just using these moves and the occasional throw, Knuckles can handle himself well. Add to this his glide, a quick and fairly safe burst option that wins trades with nearly everything, his headbutt, a tracking move that breaks barriers and causes hard knockdowns, and his ability to use air spins for counter hitting, and Knuckles offers you many of the game's strongest tools in an aggressively straightforward package. The main downside here may be that you're able to succeed with so few tools that it can make you a tad predictable. Beating Knuckles' sidestep often requires a read, but if Knuckles does get read, it is beatable. But what if Knuckles was a cute cat girl? Well, then he would be Honey the Cat, his clone character. Honey is, in essence, a hybrid of Knuckles and Amy, with most of her moves taken from Knuckles. Without the ability to scrunch herself into a ball, she has an air punch instead of an air spin, and her running punch is a variant of Amy's head slide. Although unlike Amy, she cannot use the move from a standstill, limiting the move's utility. Besides these things, Honey's model also has slightly smaller hurt boxes than Knuckles, and yet she is also a little heavier than most characters, which means strings on her tend to work differently than against most of the cast. One plus for Honey is that her hyperstart tends to have a better range than Knuckles, meaning Honey players will sometimes purposely shred their barriers in order to have access to Honey's non-hyper hyperstart, a move she can sometimes combo into itself. Honey is generally considered to be worse than Knuckles due to her lack of spin moves, which can offer some of STF's easiest counter hits, but she's plenty strong in her own right and has just enough of her own sauce to be worth playing on her own merits. Play as Knuckles or Honey if you want to see just how aggressive Sonic the Fighters can be, and if you feel most comfortable when you're in your opponent's face. So yeah, if you're a beginner player to Sonic the Fighters, Sonic, Honey, and Knuckles are all pretty good characters to get started with. But for beginning players, another character will often steal their hearts. That character being Tails. On paper, Tails looks like the weakest of STF's so-called spin dashers, with stubbier moves that tend to lock him into awkward animations, and without the space-closing tools of Sonic's sidestep punch or Knuckles' sidestep. And yet for beginner players, Tails is often a popular pick in part due to just how much of a nightmare he can be to deal with as an opponent. It helps that he has a defensive quirk known as him being very small. While his model is not dramatically different from those of other characters in the game, it's enough to make some things that work on nearly the entire cast not work on him. At times, Tails will simply phase through things, and by simply getting hit less often than other characters, Tails can be a character that naturally creates and exploits chaotic situations. On top of that, it helps that many of Tails' close-range options are very strong. His punch string ends in a rapid jab with a surprisingly large hitbox that can anti-air opponents. It's particularly dangerous near the wall, where opponents can easily end up taking every hit of the move, unable to be knocked away from it. Tails also has access to Punch Kick, which, like with Knuckles, can be used out of sidestep and is practically safe on block. His main barrier-breaking option, though, may be his Spin Dash, which, with fewer startup frames than those of the other characters, is actually a decent neutral tool for him, with some particularly devious use cases if you can exploit the move's multi-hits. Ultimately, though, it's being able to use this pressure and also have access to an extremely strong throw game that allows Tails to be such a terror. His high damage strikes will often scare an opponent into impulsively blocking or sidestepping, setting up his propeller throw, which also leaves opponents in hard knockdown. Tails' strengths don't stop there, however. He can use his half-circle forward propeller punch to use an attack that is active on frame 9. With this move being one of the fastest in the game, it can make going up against Tails especially frightening. If Tails has a weakness, it is, as stated earlier, range. Unlike Knuckles, Tails has no simple way to get in your face. Even his equivalent to Knuckles' glide, the propeller glide, is a slower and lower priority attack. When opponents decide to fight Tails by hitting and running instead of by aggressing directly, his job gets harder, as he lacks long-range options that much of the cast has some amount of access to. Sometimes the weird situations he exploits can also be turned around against him. Still, Tails players continue to get good results in tournament, and it's clear the character isn't going anywhere. Pick Tails if you like doing massive amounts of damage, want to execute a simple game plan, and don't mind getting called uncouth every now and then. Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles are all pretty expected characters to see in a Sonic fighting game, so let's move on to one of the wild cards. Bean can be a hard character to summarize. To some, he's a grappler. To some, he's a rushdown character. To others, he's a zoner. Maybe he's all of the above, and more. Bean's moveset is defined by two things: having a beak and having bombs. Instead of punching, he pecks, and his beak plays a big role in both of his character's specific grabs. When the woodpecker isn't pecking, however, he's tossing or kicking bombs. Players can often avoid Bean's bombs by simply blocking, sidestepping, or staying in motion. So ideally, Bean players should use them as a pressure tool to get opponents to go where he wants them to go, or punish them for staying stationary. Bean's jabs can be a potent tool, especially at lower levels when players don't know how to sidestep out of his punch string. That said, you can duck under this punch string, and you can also block it. But by holding forward at the end of this string, Bean can use a punch that will hit crouching opponents and also break barriers. When he isn't throwing bombs or pecking, Bean is a character that ultimately would love to grab you. His neutral grab is decent with good catch-up damage scaling, but his back-forward back command grab fierce attack is the real deal, doing massive amounts of damage and leaving his opponent in an elongated knockdown state that generally allows free bomb follow-ups for additional damage. When Bean isn't getting his grabs, his damage output can feel a little paltry, and he may lack the same element of clutch that characters like Knuckles and Tails can abuse, with less flexible options out of sidestep than many of the game's best characters. His turnaround punch also tends to be minus on hit, making scrappy situations for him harder than for other characters. Still, he can be a very expressive character, and he can abuse Hyper Mode and Hyperstart with less difficulty than many other characters. He can win by overwhelming you, but he can just as easily win by running away. Pick Bean if you want to have multiple options at your disposal, or if you just really want to have access to the best grab in the game. Alright, now that we've spoken about Bean, let's talk about the game's other projectile character. Hailing from games for the Sega Game Gear, Fang's appearance in Sonic the Fighters can be a big challenge for players who have first picked up the game, as some of his simplest moves will interact with you from across the stage. Fang's punches shoot corks from his gun. And while he's not quite a zoner, the fact that he has so much range at his disposal is integral to his gameplay. For Fang players, win conditions will often be built by creating uncomfortable situations that then force hasty reactions. Jumping versus this character is often unsafe due to the way Fang's corks can intercept landings and air techs. And while his gun may make opponents want to get close to Fang, when they do, they'll often find that this supposed zoner is actually very comfortable in close ranges, with his down forward punch being a very fast front-facing normal with a follow-up that punishes incorrect techs. Adding to the tilt factor, his throws both send opponents behind his back, forcing his opponents to once again deal with Fang's zoning before they get in his face again. Spin dashers can reflect Fang's corks with the startup of their spin dash, meaning that Fang can't simply just mash punch, however. But moves like Super Cork, which beats Spin Dash, can be utilized to keep his offensive game unpredictable. Players fond of using Hyper Mode should know that Fang also has some of the best Hyper Mode implementation for beginner players, as he can juggle players from long range with his Hyper Mode punches, in a manner that often results in a round win. If there's something that really mixes up Fang, it may be the faster characters like Sonic, Knuckles, Honey, and Tails. Sidestep punches and sidestep punch kicks often give him trouble, as a successful dodging sidestep will basically make a player immune to his corks for 14 frames. And while Fang is great at juggling, his lack of moves with strong descending hitboxes means that he can be just as susceptible to juggles himself. Still, Fang can make it work in any matchup, even if some are harder than others. Pick this character if you want to be able to threaten your opponents from anywhere, and you don't mind getting on their nerves to win. This covers all of what are considered to be the high tier characters in Sonic the Fighters, but every character in the game is viable, so if you're willing to challenge yourself a little bit, maybe consider playing Amy. Sporting her beloved classic look and featuring the debut of her iconic Pico Pico Hammer, Sonic the Fighters version of Amy is a favorite of many players and Sonic fans, even if her playstyle is definitely not for everyone. Described by STF top player KOS as a set play character, optimized Amy revolves around utilizing the fact that she has the best OTG in the game. If Amy can knock you down, she can sometimes take one opening and use it to take a full round, something rare in the world of Sonic the Fighters. The key to this is her heads up move, which used by holding barrier and holding up, then letting go of barrier and pressing down and punch, drops a random item from the sky onto your opponent. This move can be surprisingly hard to input consistently, but if you're able, you can time it around your grounded opponent's rolls to extend their knockdown and tack on additional damage. This is a very strong tool, but its downside is that Amy will often have to work harder to find openings than most characters. Many of her moves that aren't universal between characters can be sluggish to use and easy to dodge or block. And while her sidestep P is a great tool for forcing knockdowns, it's also minus on block and does not break barrier. Amy's hammer seems like it would offer a tool to outrange opponents with a disjointed hitbox, but its range is often not as useful as you might think. Despite these downsides, efforts are underway to develop Amy, with more recent efforts being put into building combos out of her half circle grab, look over there. This move works a bit like an exaggerated version of STF's universal grab Foot Crush, doing no damage, but giving the player a massive amount of plus frames that can then be used to set up elongated hyper combos. Thanks to this grab, Amy has perhaps seen more development lately in Sonic the Fighters than any other character. And even if some call her the game's worst character, she's still proven herself to be good enough to win tournaments. Pick Amy if you want to take every opening as far as it can go, and you don't mind hitting a read or two to make things go your way. Having discussed Amy, let's now talk about a character who some might call her polar opposite. An icon of the game, Bark is Sonic the Fighter's only truly original character, with Bean being largely adapted from the heroes of arcade title Dynamite Ducks, and Honey being a cat version of a Fighting Vipers character. Fittingly then, he's also the game's most unique fighter among the main cast. Unfortunately for him, this is often in ways that are not in his favor. Bark lacks some universal moves like neutral kicks, the ability to crouch, the ability to weapon grab, the ability to wall rocket, the ability to foot crush, the ability to aerial hyperstart, and the ability to sidestep skip kick, just to name a few things. Thankfully, he does have some bespoke things going his way in Sonic the Fighters that can help him make up for these shortcomings. Most surprising might be Bark's fast grounded movement, with his forward and back dashes being significantly faster than the rest of the legal cast. Using these dashes and full hop air punches to reduce landing recovery frames, Bark can at times seem like the game's fastest character, even if many of his moves will take a long time to come out. It goes without saying that Bark is big, with a taller, more muscular build than the rest of the cast, and this grants him a larger attack range with many of his moves that can help, alongside these grounded dashes, make up for his sometimes unsavory frame data. He can also use barriers in ways no other character can, with his barrier walk allowing him to move while blocking, and his barrier punch letting him block and hit with the same input. Bark's increased range unfortunately doesn't seem to extend to his throws, which despite their long reaching animation tend to only connect when used at a very close range. Despite his reputation as the game's grappler then, Bark's throws are 2 frames slower than most characters, and often require specific reads or hypermode block pressure to pull off. His large size and inability to crouch under throws means he's often more likely to be the recipient of throws than the disher out. That said, if he can land one of these higher value throws, like Biff Baff or Bark Strike, it can all but guarantee him a round. While some characters can be rather ambivalent about whether or not they have barriers, Bark is a character that definitely wants to have them. This is especially true because of just how potent his hyper mode game can be. Bark's lariat, activated by pressing punch and kick together, is transformed in hyper mode into what players often call the hyper lariat, a move that propels him forward that can be linked into itself that does massive damage. Due to the move being plus on block, those who block it will often get thrown. Of all the moves in Sonic the Fighters, hyper lariat might be the best noob killer there is, often overwhelming and terrifying those who face it, even if air techs into air spins can counter hit it. If Bark has a weakness, it may be, like for Amy, the scrap. Bark has very high damage output, but with attacks doing more damage in Sonic the Fighters when the character performing them has very little health remaining, Bark can often suffer if he fails to finish his food. Pick Bark if you like being the big guy and are willing to accept the trade-offs that come with being said big guy, and if you want access to a unique set of tools that will challenge you and your opponents. That covers all of the game's cast, except for one character. Following his debut in Knuckles Chaotix, Espio the Chameleon's appearance in Sonic the Fighters can feel a little out of left field, even if he's ultimately a pretty ordinary character. He has some unique properties, but can feel more like a grab bag of other characters' attributes on the outset. He has a spin dash and air spin, although when he spins, he twirls like a tornado instead of turning into a ball. He has one of Fang's throws, Knuckles' headbutt, and Bean's hyper warp. And like Amy, he's pretty good at hitting characters who have been knocked onto the ground. If there's anything that distinguishes Espio, it's the way he utilizes his weapon of choice, his tongue. Most notably with his half-circle punch, Long Tongue, a tool that can be used in tandem with his throws to force opponents into unsavory approaches. If Espio has an overwhelming weakness, it's most likely being similar to the likes of Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles, without the things that distinguish them as the game's best characters. Part of this weakness can be pointed to in his sidestep punch, which, unsafe on block, is probably the worst sidestep punch in the game. With these moves often being some of the game's most reliable neutral tools, this hurts Espio more than you'd think. Still, the Chameleon has an interesting set of moves. Headbutt is just as good on Espio as it is on Knuckles, leading into hard knockdowns. Espio's air spin seems to have fewer recovery frames than the air spins of the game's other spin dashers, and Espio's warp and strong OTG game can make him one of the easiest characters to implement hyper mode with. Pick Espio if you want to sample the different styles STF has to offer and trust your fundamentals to keep you afloat. That's all I got for you this time. I really appreciate all the support my Sonic the Fighters videos have gotten, and that I've gotten the opportunity to talk about this game for a larger audience as more than just an old novelty, but as a legitimate fighting game. Maybe down the line we could also do some character guides and some more in-depth mechanical breakdowns, but for now, hopefully this is enough to get you started. Picking a main in a fighting game can be a big deal, but with all that in mind, know that whoever you pick first, it's not going to be a binding choice. Many of the characters in this game share universal moves and inputs, as well as general movement attributes, and most of the game's best players have competed with multiple characters. Do not feel afraid to try things out and bounce from character to character as you find your footing. If you want to find people to play this game with and access some more in-depth documentation of STF's mechanics and character attributes, I will link the STF Discord in the description. It's been growing a lot since my last video, and there should be a decent amount of fresh players right now looking for games. If you're near Daytona, Florida, maybe even consider checking out the game at CEO 2024, where it's set to be a community-ran side event. Additional resources for the game, like my previous video on STF's mechanics and the setup guide for the game's most commonly used online platform, will be in the video description. If you want to support this channel and see content early as well as some exclusive material, I recommend my Ko-fi page. It's a pay-what-you-want page that grants you access to all sorts of material I've put together, including on Sonic the Fighters, Smash Melee, and more. Thank you to Will S, Seek Plus, Anonymous, Heart Eyes Emoji, and Saint October Original Soundtrack for your support. Also, thanks to Connor Seams for being a channel member, and thank you to everyone who's watched these videos. We're getting close to 20,000 subs, which is way more than I ever thought I'd see when I started doing this.